So we've been dealing with now we've got three chords that we know how to work, 1, 4, and 5 chords that we can use for progressions. And so now we're going to start talking about, before we start adding more predominant chords, which is pretty much what's left, right? We've talked about the 4 is our only predominant we've talked about so far, but 2 and 6 are really good predominants. 3 is usually kind of just a prolongation of 1. And 7 is a substitute chord for 5, right? 7 diminished can kind of act like a 5 chord. So before the book gets into all those different chords, the rest of the basic chords, we start talking about inversions because we see a lot of inversions. And actually, now that we have the three main categories of tonic, dominant, and predominant chords, using inversions just with those three chords, 1, 4, and 5, can actually make some really interesting music. And so this is kind of a, well, why do we use first inversion chords and all that kind of stuff? We're actually going to do this together, and this might even take a day or some of it at least. We're going to do what I imagine most of you probably kind of skip over when you see these little orange boxes, or whatever that color is, kind of peach, in the book. But we're going to actually do this together. I printed it out. We'll do a little bit of analysis here, or I will for you. And once I find where I just laid that paper, I'll try to use this. We're going to analyze this Bach chorale, kind of like what you just did for your quiz, but a little more detailed. And what's it say to do here? So before I flip over to this, the beat is subdivided in eighth notes. The first eighth note is always a chord tone. The second eighth note is either a non-chord tone or a change of voicing within the same chord. So we're going to analyze the first eighth note for each chord. Notice that other than the third chord from the end, which is a 2, 6, 5, all the other chords are 1, 4, or 5. So this is a full-on, this is just, we're going to do measures 1 through 4, but a full phrase of 4 measures and only 1, 4, and 5 chords. And this is truly a Bach piece. This is someone who could write the most complicated things you can imagine. And he's able to do some really interesting things with just those 3 chords because of the use of in the first inversion. So let's flip over to that, and we'll give it a look. We'll do it together. It's telling me my internet connection is unstable, so if things cut in and out a little bit, I apologize. The recording will get put up later at least, so that'll be good. I don't have to go, since my router hit the deck. Maybe that's why it's acting a little weird. I'll go work on it after this. All right, so always first thing we do, figure out what key something's in. And I know we're kind of zoomed out here a little bit, so hopefully you can play along. This is in the what is it, number 9 in the anthology. So first of all, figuring out what key we're in, of course. In this case, it looks like G major. I don't see a lot of sharps or anything anywhere. So G major. And we're going to analyze, as I said, the first eighth note of every beat, because some of the second eighth notes, there's these passing tones and non-chord tones that we otherwise see. So G major, this is a 1 chord. G, G, B, D. Another 1 chord here, 1, right? G, B, D, double the G. F sharp, A, D, C. Here's a good example. So and this is where maybe you want to have this piece of scrap paper handy, or just respell the chord as a triad, right? D, F sharp, A. And in the key of G major, D, F sharp, A is a 5 chord, right? And notice that I'm putting the tops on my V's. Please do that. So many of you still didn't do that on the exam. I tried to give you credit where I could, but good Lord, people. We've talked about this and we've talked about this. But notice that the third is in the bass, right? D, F sharp, A. So this is a D major triad with the A doubled, but there's an F sharp in the bass. So that makes this a first inversion triad. This is a 5, 6. Right? And a little note of things, like sometimes you'll see this, sometimes you'll see this. I'm okay with either, honestly. There are arguments to be made for why you might see both. I think the book does this more, where it puts the 6 kind of on the bottom like that. There are reasons. We don't need to get into them. I'm actually okay with either one of those things. 5/6 GBD. This is just a plain Jane 1 chord, right? GBD. C E G is a 4 chord. Make sure, some of you I noticed on the exam we're putting for 4 chords. This IV lowercase, that's a minor 4 chord, which in the minor key, the 4 chord is minor, but in a major key, the 4 chord is major. So we use capital Roman numeral C, E, G. That's a major triad. So 4, 4, B, B, G, D. So G, B, D with the bass, this is a 1/6 chord. The bass is on the 3rd. So G, B, D. We spell that out. That's a 1 chord in G major, but the B is in the bass. So this is a 1/6 chord, right? And then passing tone and D, F sharp, A, 5 chord with the root in the bass. So we're good there. No inversion. 5, and then this is G, B, D, 1. All right. Is everybody cool so far? This makes sense? Yeah. And already so far, we're kind of answering the question, what's it saying about, what does this do? If we had used a 5 chord here, a regular root position 5 chord here, and a root position 1 chord here, the easy answer is it just wouldn't be as interesting, right? The bass motion here is a lot smoother, G, F sharp, back to G, than had we gone G, down to a D, back to G, down to a C. It would have been bouncing all over the damn place. But because we're able to use first inversion triads, or in this case, Bach is able to use first inversion triads, we end up with a much smoother, more interesting bass line. And so when it jumps down to the 4 here, the root position 4, you can just go down by a half step because of that 1/6. You can go down to the B instead of having to jump back up to the G. That was root position. So it makes for a much more interesting and smooth bass line in the bass. Let's keep going. So C, E, G, this is a 4 chord. C, and it's a root position because the C's in the bass. D, F sharp, A, it's a 5 chord, root position. E, G, C, E, E, G, C. That's a C, E, G, that's a 4 chord, but the root is the 3rd of the chord. So that's a 4/6 right here. You see that? That's a 4/6. Then this 3rd beat here of bar 3, G, B, D, the G in the bass, so that's just a 1 chord. Remember, we're just doing the first 8th note of each group. E, E, G, C, that's another 4/6. So we've kind of done a 4/6, 1, 4/6 thing, which goes to a straight up 4, C, E, G, ignoring A, C, E, G. This is the one where, yeah, the book gave us this one. It said this is actually a 2/6/5 chord, which is something we haven't really encountered yet, but it's an interesting one. So the book actually gave us that one. And that's all because of this A right here. Otherwise, it really would act as a 4 chord. 5, D, F sharp, D. We're missing the A, but that's okay. We can leave out. Actually, no, we have the A because that's holding through. So D, F sharp, A, 5 chord, and then G, B, D, root position 1. So there aren't very many of these first inversion triads in this Bach example, but there's 4 of them, in fact, out of all those chords. But they're really, really useful. And the moments where Bach decides to use them, they make things a lot more interesting and a lot smoother, so that the bass line is just as melodic in some ways as the rest of the voices. Okay, so that's what the book asked us to do here, and it sort of gives us a sense of why we might want to use first inversion triads, how useful they can be. So a few different uses and functions of these. Let's see, where am I point out with this? Yeah, the voice leading is kind of what leads to this. So the 1/6 in measure 14, this is talking about this next example. this Mozart. So the 1/6 here, yeah, the voicing of this. The 4 goes to the 1/6, and this is piano voicing. Notice this is not really 4-part chorale voicing. This is for piano. But the fact of using an inversion here actually literally just makes this easier to play, right? So your hands aren't jumping around. Your left hand doesn't have to jump around as much here. And we still get good voice leading. So the 4 chord here, which is in root position, leads to a 1/6, which is really close to that same voicing. Literally just these 2 voices right here dive down into these 2 voices right here without much issue. And then the same thing happens. The 5/6 jumps up all of a sudden, but it does that so that it can resolve to this 1, which is up a good bit too. So these notes here, this A resolves to the B flat, and this F resolves to the F, stays on the F through. So the 5/6. So instead of using a root position 5 chord, what that would mean if you had to play this with a root position 5 chord, since we're in the key of what, B flat major, this would have to be an F, throw the A in there somewhere else, and then that would just have to jump up to all of a sudden this B flat and F. This is the way we voice the 1 chord. So it's kind of it saves a lot of problems in this case by using these inverted chords, first inversion. And so yeah, the stressing, the 7/1 voice leading suddenly gets stressed now because it's the lowest note in the chords, the piece, the bass note. Let's listen to that actually. Yeah, it's subtle, but I think especially right here, you can really hear that bass note, that A going to the B flat, sort of helps land that piece, that 1 chord really well right there, because we hear that leading tone going to 1. Sorry again for my internet. My internet says it's kind of acting weird, so we'll see. Okay. Yeah, okay. So because they're less stable, this is something important. This adds to our knowledge from last chapter about cadences. So we have a new rule now. I mentioned this last time, but let's make sure we know this. It sticks now. The PAC only happens not only when the soprano ends on the first scale degree, but also both 5 and 1 have to be in root position. So the only true perfect authentic cadence are 5-1 in root position, both of those chords. Even if the soprano ends up on scale degree 1, but the chords, either of the 5 or the 1 chord, are not in root position. So we have a 5/6-1 or a 5-1/6. Those are both imperfect. So we have a new rule for imperfect authentic cadences. So the rule last chapter was the soprano ended up anywhere but 1. But another version of an imperfect authentic cadence is the soprano ends up on scale degree 1, but one of the 2 chords is in inversion. Okay? Should be pretty straightforward, but it's just expanded that rule just a little bit. PAC is still what it's always been. Soprano's on scale degree 1, and it's a 5-1 root position progression. Okay. Most of the time, when we have a first inversion triad, it's going to be prolonging a root position triad. Right? Say that again. Most of the time when we have a first inversion triad, its whole job is to prolong a root position triad. And so we have some examples of that here. Most of the time, this is what we're going to see. So we've kind of got the 2 levels of theory going on here. We've got a root position 1 chord in A minor triad. And then right here, the bass goes to the C, which is the 3rd of the chord. So this is why that 6 is here. So this is 5 is for root position. 6 is to show that in the bass, we've gone to first inversion, right? But really the way we hear that is that whole section we sort of hear as a 1 chord. All 3 of these beats here, 3, 1, 2, all of these 3 beats really sound like a 1 chord. And then the same thing happens here. So the 5, yeah, it doesn't label the 6 here, but it does go to first inversion here. So E, G sharp B is the chord we're looking for, E, G sharp B. And then, no, it doesn't, sorry. I'm looking at it wrong. It stays on the E. So this is just a 5 chord all the way, regular 5 chord. But it lands on a 1/6, and this truly is a 1/6 though, right? So this is an actual, it's not, it's a cadence to the 1/6. So this is an imperfect authentic cadence right here in the middle of the phrase. And then 1, and then a 4/6 to a 5. So this is sort of showing different ways that we can use these. And it's circled for us. And again, this nomenclature, we're going to do a lot. You're going to do a lot more of this in theory too. Circling the non-chord tone. So all these notes that are circled, these are not being counted in what we're considering the chord. There's a bit of an art to that you'll learn later on as you do it. But let's listen to this, and we can kind of hear, even though this goes to a first inversion, 1 chord right here, it still very much sounds just like a 1 chord. There you go. All right. Something I should note too, and this showed up in the quiz. Really, if you end a phrase on a 5 chord, even if it's a 4 that comes before it, that really is a half cadence. We talked about half cadence being 1/5, but in a broader sense, half cadences are considered pretty much anything that ends on a 5 chord. It's an open cadence at the end. Okay. So a couple other things, and we're gonna call it for today. You do have some homework to work on for Wednesday that I think you've got enough to go on to get started with. Maybe we'll go over the homework first thing together on Wednesday. We'll also talk about these quizzes that you just took. But a couple of things that will happen because of this. I keep getting an unstable thing. All right. A couple of things that will happen because of this this use of sort of prolonging a chord by using its first inversion. We'll often have arpeggiation. So this is really what's happening in the bass. I mean, we're already arpeggiating. So in this first example, we're arpeggiating the 1 chord. We're playing the root and the third of the 1 chord to arpeggiate. That's really all this means. And then what also happens a lot of times is because we need the missing note of the chord that we get when we move the bass, we'll exchange it with another voice. And so this is called a voice exchange. So this is pretty typical. And this cross here is showing us where the voice exchange is. So there's an A in the first 1 chord, and the bass goes to the C, which is the note that the soprano had first. So since the bass stole the soprano note, it exchanges out and the soprano gets the bass note. So this will often happen. So the 2 middle voices actually stay the same. Alto stays on the E, the tenor stays on the A. And then the bass and the soprano have a voice exchange, right? This happens again over here in C when it goes the other way. It goes a 1/6 to a 1 chord. And there's a voice exchange between the bass and the soprano here. So we'll often see that marked. It doesn't have to happen though. So in B, we have an example here where it's just an arpeggiation of the bass and a bit of an arpeggiation even in the alto and soprano, but we don't do any actual voice exchanges. Nobody takes over any notes from anybody else. They just hit different notes on the second chord because they don't trade notes exactly. Everybody changes to different notes with the chord here. Okay, except for the tenor, which holds through. Finally, and we'll stop here today. As you note here, again, we're hearing 2 levels of things. A lot of times you're going to sort of hear this surface level more obviously. It's going to sound like a 1 chord all the way through these chords. So just keep in mind as we learn to analyze the crap out of every single chord, and we're going along vertically dealing with all of this information, we can do this. We can call this a 1 chord, a 1/6 chord, a 5 chord, but the way we're going to sort of hear it when we play it is a 1 to a 5 chord. That's really how it's functioning at a larger level. Okay, we'll pick up there next time. Any final questions or anything? Get your quizzes in if you haven't done so already. Take the pictures, get the quizzes turned into Canvas, and give the homework a look. We'll start with it. If you don't get it turned in by Wednesday, that's fine. That one can be late because we'll go through it in class. I'd like to take some time with that Wednesday. So, all right. Let me know if you need some help. If anybody wants to stick around for a few minutes, I don't have to run. So, otherwise, free to go. Have a good day. Thanks, folks.